Hey, you want to know what my second least favorite thing is about registering a new car? It's paying for it. You want to know what my least favorite thing is about registering a new car? It's going to the county courthouse and waiting in those accursed lines forever. And then when you get done with one line, they're like, okay, there are just 9 more lines. And that's just how government works. You expect it to be slow. You expect it to be arduous. Bureaucracy just grinds things to a halt. And that is almost always a horrible feeling. But in Acts chapter 24, we're going to look at a story where government bureaucracy is actually harnessed by God to make the gospel thing and Paul's career in doing his whole go around and tell people about Jesus routine work better. How is that possible? Well, you're just going to have to hang around and watch this video to find out. I am Matt Whitman. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour. Here we go. Every episode lately, we've been doing this review thing where I get you up to speed on how we got to where we are. It's time to see if we can do this one efficiently. Tina, please put 45 seconds on the clock for the review. Tell me when.
Now.
Paul's been going on these missionary journeys all around the Mediterranean world, and they've been going very well, but he feels like he has to go back to Jerusalem to face the headquarters of his opposition, the angry Jewish religious types who like control and don't like Jesus. People tell him don't go because they're going to murder you, but Paul's like, I'm going anyway. So he goes and he bends over backwards to accommodate them, but it doesn't matter. They do try to murder him. The Romans step in and are like, hey, you can't murder people like that. Tell us what's going on. So Paul and them tell him what's going on, and the Romans are like, I don't know. It seems weird. Paul's under house arrest when a bunch of Jewish zealots get together and say, let's make an oath to God to lie to get Paul to come into public, and then we'll murder him because God loves lying and murder. But a kid hears about it, he warns Paul and the Roman leader, and Paul has to go north to Caesarea with a military escort, which is where we get to chapter 24. I was rushing a little bit at the end. Please pause and read this entire chapter, and then we'll pick it up in a second. At the end of chapter 3, we see there's a letter addressed to this guy named Felix. And to us, reading this 2,000 years after the fact, Felix is just some guy who works in an office, and I'm sure he had a very important title, but we tend to diminish the importance of such characters in our minds just because of history and because we imagine that if we traveled back in time, we would be king of everything. But Felix was a pretty big deal, and he occupied an important role. He was procurator of Judea. Now, this was not a role that had existed for a real long time at this point. Herod the Great governed Judea on behalf of the Roman Empire for the 30 or 40 years before Jesus, and he died in 4 BC. And when he died, he figured he'd do what kings do, hand it off to his oldest son. But his oldest son was a great big idiot who loved to murder people just like his dad, but his dad had at least earned the political capital to be allowed to murder people and get away with it as a big silly rascal who just likes murder. But his son was a dirty rat who didn't have the credibility to murder and have it be cute. So Rome came in and deposed him, and rather than having some other ethnic leader, they're like, you know who's good at governing you people? The Romans. So we're going to start appointing our own people. And Pontius Pilate was one of these procurator governor characters, and Felix was another one. So this Felix guy has a lot on the line. He's been told, just keep it together. We don't want riots. We don't want crazy stuff. Collect taxes. If you make it work, you're going to climb the political ladder and things are going to be good. So now we know a little bit more about the motives of this Felix guy as he's about to listen to a religious debate he does not care very much about. But what he's really interested in is, am I going to be able to keep the peace here, and what move do I need to make that happen? So this courtroom drama, which is essentially what chapter 24 is, begins with Ananias, this high priest who Paul called a whitewashed wall a chapter earlier, showing up in Caesarea with a lawyer named Tertullus. I got to read this part, even though I know you definitely already read all of this on pause, because it is so drippingly gross. Here's how it starts. When Paul was called in, Tertullus, the lawyer, presented his case before Felix. We have enjoyed a long period of peace under you, and your foresight has brought about reforms in this nation. Everywhere and in every way, most excellent Felix, we acknowledge this with profound gratitude. But in order not to weary you further, I would request that you be kind enough to hear us briefly. That's disgusting. It's just dripping with falsehood. They didn't think any of that crap. They hated this dude. They hated the Romans. They partnered with the Romans at times only so they could connive to get rid of the Romans. And it was only a few years after this that the Romans came along and said, look, we see through your dumb scheme, and we're wiping out your entire temple system and all of it. So this is designed to smack of falsehood, and it's very successful in smacking of falsehood. So then we get into the actual charges, and the charges are, this guy's a troublemaker, he stirs up riots amongst the Jews and all over the world, he's a ringleader of this sect, and you will see all of this for yourself, oh great wise Felix, if you just listen to what we say and don't listen to what he says. And these have been the charges against Christians and against Paul everywhere they've gone. They know, that is, the religious forces that oppose Paul and the Christians know that the one leverage they can get with Rome is to give the impression that the Christian stuff is dangerous to the stability of the state. And maybe in some ways they have a point, because Christianity did end up dramatically altering Roman culture eventually. But as we're talking about it here, these things are just trumped up charges. This is not true. In fact, it's a technique that we've seen a lot in recent years in the United States. The technique goes like this. Oh, you're saying things that are critical of things that I like. Well, that could cause someone to be violent because they might take your disagreeing too seriously. So therefore, you shouldn't say those things. And effectively, by disagreeing with a thing that I'm into, you are stirring up riots and violence. Or even saying, what? You think that thing? Well, that's so outrageous that me and my friends are going to come and be violent in response to your thing we don't like. Look at how violent and dangerous that man's ideas are. That kind of stuff. And if you're sitting there and you're like, yeah, the other team is like that. Okay, just reflect on that for a minute. Because I'm not saying one team's like that or the other. I'm saying that's how we do business too often now. So we recognize the technique that they're using here, and it's a gross one. Everything about the prosecution is pretty slick and pretty dirty. But Paul comes back with that same tell the truth attitude that we talked about in the last episode. And his response is not to butter the guy up any more than to say, I know for a number of years you've been a judge over this nation, so I gladly make my defense. That's all we get from Paul. And then he goes into his defense. Paul uses 3 techniques in his defense. He uses details to say, what that guy just said to you after he buttered you up is not even accurate. Go check with witnesses. That's not what happened. I came here as a person of peace. I went to that place. I behaved well. I was ceremonially clean. I did everything I was supposed to do. Then he gets into theology. He says, I don't actually even disagree with these people. We have the same hope in the resurrection. We have the same belief in the law. I uphold the law. I'm into all the same things that they are. Implicitly suggesting to Felix they must have some other motive since we believe the same stuff. And then the third thing he goes with is to redirect accusation, to say, I haven't caused any rioting, but there are some angry Greek Jewish religious people who stirred all of this up, and maybe they're the ones who should be here talking with you. So Paul's defense in this case is different than the defense we've seen in other places. In other places, Paul has been talking to a Jewish audience, and he's been trying to evangelize, trying to convince these people to think differently about Jesus. But with Felix, it's more of an actual defense. And so it's kind of fun to see Paul take the gloves off, play the role of the Roman citizen and the orator a little bit, and make what is summarized as a pretty convincing case. Side note, when you study the Bible and you think critically about it, one of the questions you'll often ask should be, how did the author know this stuff? And there are a few places in the Bible where there's really no answer other than inspiration, something miraculous happened. And I understand that can be problematic for many people. For me, I've learned to work with it. But places like this, it's kind of fun to think about, like, oh, where did he get this data? Oh yeah, it was a trial. It was a public hearing. So Luke, all the way back at the beginning of Acts and at the beginning of Luke, says, I gathered this data, I talked with witnesses, and I'm presenting an organized, ordered account. So this is one of those places where we can imagine Luke the historian just going and collecting public records and saying, okay, well, they said this is who was here, this is who the lawyer was, and this is how the whole thing worked out. I don't say that to demystify the Bible, but I think processing how the Bible came to be and how the inspired authors worked with it helps us to get a more robust picture of what's going on here. Here's how the home stretch of this passage works out. Felix hears the prosecution and the defense and ultimately decides to do nothing. He's going to leave Paul in an extended, nice version of prison, and he's going to do this as a favor to the Jews, who he will not ultimately allow to kill Paul. If he keeps it in this holding pattern, that'll function like a pocket veto, And he's hoping that he will get one of two things: either a gigantic bribe out of Paul or his followers, which would make it worth his while to take the risk of setting Paul free, or he'll just get promoted and not have to settle this at all. He can kick the can down the road to whoever comes after him. But we get a little interesting aside in here that tells us that Felix showed up again to hear Paul with his wife Drusilla in tow. Drusilla is very, very interesting. She comes up just briefly in the Bible, but she epitomizes the politics of this whole era, and she also died in a spectacularly interesting fashion. And the way you can find out how is by watching my bonus video on Drusilla, or Google. The last verse of the chapter tells us that even though Paul and Felix actually interacted quite a bit, Paul stayed in this state of being in prison in Caesarea for 2 years. That feels tragic. It's 2 years out of the life of a guy who is in his prime, who didn't do anything wrong. He won the case. The other side isn't getting satisfaction. But because of government, political, bureaucratic, corrupt stuff, he's just stuck there in this holding pattern. And if we don't look at anything about the historical context, it's easy to feel like 24 is a great big tragedy. But if you do know something about the historical context, it can look a little bit different. Somewhere in this time, we see a transition from the Emperor Claudius to the less stable Emperor Nero, who was a young man when he came into power. And we also know that during this time, the Jews and the Gentiles were not getting along well in the northern part of Judea. We also know that during this time, Felix had a hard time managing those tensions, and things got a little bit out of hand. So out of hand that the Romans came in and replaced Felix with somebody else. Which causes me to suspect that if Paul had been at large during that time, he probably wouldn't have survived this little era of volatility. Big dumb government bureaucracy, which is normally infinitely frustrating, actually served a providential purpose, it would seem, in Acts chapter 24. Final thought / observation / whatever you want to call it. In chapter 24, we see Paul with a foot in two worlds, and we see him wrestling with something that the church and Christianity and religious people in general have wrestled with since forever. How do you be both of these things at once? How do you operate under completely different sets of ground rules? I mean, the state is a powerful entity to be taken seriously no matter how much you do or don't like it. A government is that entity in society which holds a monopoly on violence, which means that most governments, though we'd like them to be nice, reserve for themselves the right to kill if they need to kill somebody for the greater good. The greater good. And so Paul is trying to accomplish this transcendent spiritual thing that's going to, transform existence for all of time, and that he believes will bring hope and life to everybody who needs it and redeem all of creation. But to do that, he's got to shrewdly and smartly navigate this world system. Well, in future videos, I want to talk about all the different ways that Christians in the church have proposed or experimented with to try to navigate the tension between these two worlds, some of which to more effect and some of which to less effect. That'll have to be a conversation for another day. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour. We'll see you soon.